All right, welcome back to another episode of Raise 'Em Up, podcast I was about to just say for parents, but it's not just for parents. It's about for anybody who's interested in what it means to raise up. I wanted to say kids, and then I'm going, no, the next generation, whoever you consider that to be, raising them up in the faith. Now, of course, we're focusing in on adolescents, especially as we pick up this book, Sticky Faith from the Fuller Youth Institute, written about a little over a decade ago, but still so relevant. And we jump in now to chapter 6, which is called Sticky Justice, okay? And so we were kind of having a little bit of a pre-conversation, but we decided to pause it so that we could actually have it when we were talking, because it was one of those, like, let's not get the good stuff out before people are listening with us, right? And so let's just talk about it. That word, justice, is a really tough word in today's context, all right? And yet this chapter is so convicting of the biblical understanding of justice, but then also where it'll go too is this balance of what does it mean to make it the thing that you are about, not just something you do it every once in a while, right? Okay, so let's just talk about the stickiness of the word and when I say stickiness, I'm not talking in the way of the book. And then we can get into what the book says, because then it will be the stickiness of justice, right? But the controversy of justice right now. And how do you balance this in a conversation about, we have to talk about justice, but it's so confusing in today's world? I'm going to lay that bomb in the middle of the table and see what happens.
Well, yeah. So when I read the title of the chapter, I was like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
This is going to be interesting, because I wasn't sure where it was going. I was like, oh, because it's such a trigger word right now.
I like that.
I mean, that's the way I would think about it, that anytime that you hear it or see it in social media, my little antennas automatically go up, and I'm like, uh-oh, here comes a soapbox, or here, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's so much going on in our country and in our world right now.
And it feels like everybody is trying to claim a piece of the social justice movement. And some of the motives are beautiful and good and God-pleasing, and some of them get really messy and really unfortunate quickly.
Yeah. Well, and I like a word you just added to it, right? Social justice, because that
Yes.
helps us clarify a few things. I mean, I remember, and I don't know if we'll get in trouble for this tonight. We'll find out. We had a symposium, which is a fancy word for conference, up at seminary, and the topic was social justice. And I laughed. Okay, I was a seminarian, and this is probably not appropriate, but I did. I laughed because I was like, Lutherans, what are Lutherans about to say about social justice, you know?
Yeah.
And lo and behold, the conference went on, and I watched as very brilliant men got up there to talk, and it was one of those, are you going to get to the topic? Because
yeah.
to some extent, I do believe the Lutheran Church has always struggled with talking about justice. Now, lo and behold, who was the presenter that made the most sense as they talked and gave us actual practical things? Because most of us going to seminary are very practical thinkers. What does this mean for me in the parish and things like that? I don't remember if this was pre-vicarage or post-vicarage, because I think post-vicarage, clarify, vicarage is a piece of the pastoral formation experience in seminary where you go and you learn for a year at another congregation. And so I usually it's 2 years vicarage, and then you come back for your final year. For me, it was 3 years vicarage. You come back for your final year. And after getting that practical hands in the dirt type of experience on vicarage, you come back like very challenging almost. This needs to be practical. The one that made the most sense, the Catholic. And it was and I could have predicted that, because the Catholic Church is really good about doing justice, the work, biblically speaking, of justice, without really having to talk about it or give big presentations on it. Because ultimately, I think where I land is serving and loving your neighbor. When I think about justice, when I think about people that are hurting in this world, when you think about being the hands and feet of Jesus, a phrase that we do like, we have that. But like you guys have said, especially after 2020, and really and truly since maybe 2016, we have really seen this movement that kind of clouds the word justice in our minds and things like that, and makes us want to be quiet, particularly I think sometimes as Lutherans when it comes to what it means. And truly, there's so many conversations we could have about this too, because there's a level of to which what does it mean, right? Good Lutheran question. To do justice. What does that look like? To serve and love my neighbor. How does that become who I am, not what I do? Right? All of these kind of balance out. Keith, you've been a little quiet, and that face for they can see it here. Anybody watching with it, but you're very
Sorry for
pensive,
that.
very thinking, very thoughtful. Yeah. What thoughts do you have on this conversation?
Well, I mean, it is pretty sticky. I mean, I think everybody has their own definition. And when you think of justice, sometimes I think you can feel alone about it. And you say, yeah, it's just us, that kind of stuff. But yeah, how do you incorporate this into your DNA? Is and it's who I am, not what I do. And that would be my thought about justice. It's who you are.
Yeah.
Not just your actions, and you don't do it because it's something to do. You do it because, hey, we do it. We help each other. We take care of each other, and it's got to be something ingrained in us. Very intentional.
Yeah, I think it's easy, like in today's world, to say, hey, look what I did, right? I'm
Yes,
good
tempting,
at this.
super tempting.
Where it's just a one-time thing, or it's just you're doing it for whatever, the TikTok video or the post on social media. You know what I mean? Because everyone else around me is doing it, not because you have intrinsic kind of need or desire to do it.
I like what you said, Keith, about just us. Like that, I think is a big temptation too, that in a movement, again, that can be really grounded and rooted in God's heart. We tend to focus in on being angry and being, what has been done to me or what has been done to this group of people that I want to help or embody. And that becomes militant and it loses the heart of God. When it becomes about, I'm angry and where's my justice, instead of those people are hurting or this person is hurting, where is the justice that I can show them from God? And I think that if we can wrap our heads around that, I think the messiness of the word justice goes away, because it's God himself who says, let justice roll down.
Yeah.
I mean, he is a God who wants to right wrongs. He is a God who wants to break prisoners free. He's a God who wants to lift up the marginalized and the broken and make them whole. And only he can do that. We can't.
Right.
Yes.
So when we start, worrying about like, what can I do and what can my hashtag do or what can this and that do? Oh, no. Like what we have to offer is we have to offer the justice that only God can provide. And that's the hope of Jesus Christ.
I love a lot of what I'm hearing right now, because I heard like the TikTok, I heard the hashtag, and I remember probably the year after I graduated college. So I was in seminary, but there was a lot of stuff going down at my college, and I ended up writing for the Hilltop News because there was this level of people cared enough to post on their Facebooks, to change their profile pictures with very big problems and things like that, but nobody cared enough to get out and actually do something. So there was a layer to which I was just calling it out. Like, this is not how things get done. This is not how things get accomplished. Like, you can't just sit behind your keyboard or your cell phone and expect change to happen because you're emotionally invested. Exactly. I was gonna say you emoted enough, right? Yeah. And so the other thing I love though too that I was hearing was this reclaiming God's perspective of justice. Because I remember one of my first experiences at seminary was working in an after-school program, which was with a charter school. It was a Lutheran school who, up in St. Louis, there was this issue of Lutheran schools needing to close down because enrollment wasn't matching up with it. And so this organization came together out of one of the churches to say, let's put a charter school in here. We're not going to get the other crowd that we used to get. Let's let the city do a charter school. We'll run after-school programs for them. And the pastor there that led conversations, one of the big conversations he would like to have with the students is about how God is just and God is love, right? And so there's a level of him wanting to right wrongs, and there's a level of him showing love. And he would go through all of Scripture to show them how God is both just and love. It's like right and left hand every single time. And it was so wonderful to see that. And there's that level of, okay, we can talk about justice. Like, I'm a big fan of crime shows, and I've learned this, right? It's because I need justice.
We all do.
I need justice.
Yeah.
I need the wrong things in life to be righted, right? That's where my heart is. I love watching the bad guy get caught. I love watching the innocent person be set free. I love all of that kind of stuff because our hearts kind of long for justice. And I think that's a lot of times when we truly do talk about loving and serving our neighbor, we've got to ask that question of, is your heart hardened to the hurt of this world and the hurt around you? And I think we've had a good enough setting of this conversation to really get to dive into some of the stuff we heard in this chapter too. Because one of the things that resonated with me in this chapter, and I'm kind of going out of order, but we can certainly come back to wherever we want to come back to. When it comes to your kids, when it comes to students, what do they end up like really being drawn toward when it comes to justice? Stuff that actually affects them or their world. So things that they actually know are happening. I mean, I think I recognize, this past fall, we had that tragedy, right, with losing a baby to a disease. But you see our students stepping up for that and caring about that and wearing shirts. You see our congregation doing the same thing. Especially, I think the chapter mentioned this, girls enter into high school and all of a sudden they find a deep passion and interest in helping those in the sex trafficking world and things like that, because the world is cruel to women, right? And we can say that, right? That's not a political statement. It's a reality we have to face. And so they become more aware of how cruel the world can be towards women, especially in a sexual way and things like that. And so they become a little more compassionate for women who have been through that too. And Melanie, I know that you've especially been able to walk through that in your history with the high school and being able to teach and things like that. So unpack
Absolutely.
a little bit of that for us.
Yeah, the concept of God's heart being present all through Scripture. And I think a lot of times we look at the Old Testament God and we think like, oh, he, demanding justice, but justice was always to crush us for our sin. No. The God of the Old Testament speaks time and time again about how he will lift up those who have been abused and how he gets angry for us in our sin because it's our sin that causes the injustices that affect all his people on earth. And so I think that moving that conversation again toward God's heart, and that God's heart is just because it's loving, right? And it's justice and it's mercy. Not only does God have a heart for those who are hurting, but he also even has a heart for those who caused the hurt. Like that whole mind warp of like, yeah, if you're sitting there indignant and wanting justice and ready to fight, you better be looking in the mirror too. Because not only is God seeking justice for those who are hurting, but he's also giving mercy to those who cause the hurt. And so the entire unpacking of the concept of justice in the high school classes has been a really cool thing, especially to give them those tangible, close to home moments, as well as those bigger global pictures. For example, Houston is like the number one hub for sex trafficking and just human slavery on our continent. That's horrific, and yet we don't talk about it very much. We're seeing movements growing, and I think that's a wonderful, again, good, God-pleasing thing. And our students are excited when they see that the church is moving, that the church, it does have a heart for the same things that they are seeing that are wrong with the world.
Exactly. And one of the things I heard you talk about too, it was kind of layered in how you put it, was perspective is everything too.
Yeah.
Right? If we're seeking justice for ourselves, first and foremost, I think that's where we're going to find ourselves in a tough spot. Like it's really easy. And I'm trying to balance this because I think you do need to want justice for yourself.
Oh, sure.
But I also recognize, and this is primarily theological brain working here, but at the heart of sin is what? Self. Incurvatus se, right? Latin means curved in, incurvatus, on itself. That's the heart curved in on itself is sinful. And so, but here's the other, and this is what I think God says so often, like, and certainly clarifies it through his son, love me first, love your neighbor as yourself. Because when we care that much about our neighbor, when it's outside of us, when we have nothing to gain, that's where true justice is accomplished. Because like trying to accomplish justice for yourself can come across as selfish and cannot make traction in this world. But when we do as God has asked us to do, to go for our neighbors and things like that, that's where we find things. I'm reminded of, y'all had a CSA class probably like 4 years ago. And I still remember a student who picked a very not normal, at least for the typical places that people draft. And it was for veterans. It was for veterans coming back. And the kid was so impassioned about, and it was because it was close to home for him, how he knew. And that was so important for him. And I loved seeing that in him, even though it was so different than what everybody else was choosing and things like that. And it just goes back to like, find that thing that's close to home. And here's the research of the book, right? Your kids do want this stuff. I mean, I was certainly convicted when it came to, they surveyed a group of kids and they said, what do you want more of in youth group? And what was last on the list? Do you remember?
Like games.
Games was on the very last of the list. First one was deeper conversations.
Yep.
Second one was mission trips. Third one was service projects. Okay. So again, I think we're working our way a little bit backwards, but Keith, I know we were talking about before we began a little bit, and we kind of started the conversation this way. It's not so much about what you do, it's who you are. And trying to help our kids understand and ourselves understand, especially with the temptations of social media, this isn't about an event. This isn't about what you do. It's about who you are. Unpack that for us. What does that mean when it comes to mission trips, when it comes to service projects, when it comes to doing things? Because certainly from a school perspective, over the years you've seen, and I get frustrated with it, there's this temptation of, I'm doing this because I need hours. I'm doing this because I need to get this many and I need to go to college and things like that. And it's more of the what you do rather than who you are. Unpack that for us.
Well, one of the phrases I always hear is people like say, well, we hope we hit a home run with this, or we hope we blow the roof off the place, or in events like that. If we're looking to self-serve ourselves and get some big spiritual awareness out of a mission trip or doing well, that doesn't always happen. I mean, you have to let God be God, and God has a time and a purpose for everything, and it may not be that cataclysmic. It may not be that huge, but let God work in your heart and you can see good. But too often I think people look at the home run. It has to be something major, like, wow, it was just overwhelmingly uplifting. Well, it may or may not be, but there will always be poor. There will always be the needy. So there's always that kind of need out there, and this isn't a one-time event in your life. It should be something that you continually do, continually seek. And not every event is like in the Bible. There's a lot of events not recorded in the Bible. It wasn't always a flood. It wasn't always a plague. It was just day to day, today, today. And again, it goes back to who you are more than what you do. The other thing that I hear in justice that I think the book doesn't use this word, but in today's vocabulary is fairness. We're always looking at that. Kids, love to say that's not fair, and it's not really, like. So if I do good things will happen, right? I get rewarded, and I go back to Cain and Abel on that. And Abel gave an offering from the heart and expected nothing in return. Cain gave and expected something, and when he didn't think it was fair that Abel got God's blessing when he didn't, but Abel gave it for unselfish reasons and Cain did. And then, of course, we all know that story. So, but again, I think there's a lot of that Cain in us that think, hey, if I do good, I'm going to what? I'm going to get something. Why? I always tell people, like, I don't know why God made me so good looking instead of rich. Like, that's not fair. And of course, kids like to argue that I got gypped twice, but it's kind of like that. And if we're always seeking to serve, our own brand of justice, I get what I put into it. It's really not that. It's rewards of from the Spirit aren't materialistic. Now, they might look good on my resume for college if am part of clubs, but then I'm just doing it to get something on paper. But I do it because it's just the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I'm hearing, as you're talking, I'm hearing Jesus, right? So a couple of different times, right? When you said, poor will always be with you. That's a quote of Jesus Christ. I mean, he says they're always going to be with you. When I hear you talking about fairness, I think of Jesus's parables about how the
laborers in the field, yeah.
laborers, right? They get so upset. He got the same thing I did. That's not fair. I worked longer. And he's like, are you mad because I'm generous? Right? And so
Yeah.
when you think about our own justice, when we actually go and help people, we're not going to help people necessarily because they deserve it. Because y'all, that's the conversation I hear,
yes.
especially, and I'll call us out because I would consider myself more conservative. I consider myself moderate most of the time. But at the end of the day, I just want to classify myself as someone who follows Jesus, whatever that
Yes.
means. I don't know what political party he
Amen.
lands in. That depends on the day, depending on what people want. But I don't do it because people deserve it. On the conservative lines, I hear, well, they deserve it, and they put themselves in that position, and they didn't work hard enough, and they didn't do this, and they're drug addicts, and they did this, and I was like, y'all, that doesn't mean we don't help them. I don't deserve what God has given to me.
And honestly, there's so much data to suggest the opposite, that what we think is deserved and what we think is the result of this person's decisions and A to B to C, it really isn't always that way. How dare we assume we know a person's motives and all of their actions, and that God is handing them justice in that way? Is that how the whole Bible worked? That every person had a bad hand because they deserved it, and that that wickedness didn't ever get to prosper.
Well, again, going to the why was this man blind? Was it his sin or his parents' sin? Like that was an encounter with Jesus, and Jesus was like, yeah, that's not the point, right? That's kind of the summary of that one. And so I think it's important for us because I do think that this can become such a political conversation, and it does not need to be. And that's why I hesitate to land in anywhere on a political spectrum and just say, I just want to help people.
Right.
like, can we help people? Because ultimately, like, again, think about yourself. When you think about yourself and the mercy and grace that God has shown to you, we're left in one place, feeling pretty guilty. What do you mean? Like, what do you mean I can't measure up? What do you mean I can't do enough? What do you mean? I've done my best. I've done the hardest. Yeah, okay. But the standard is perfection.
Right.
And every single one of us falls short of that. And so, and that's where I think that phrase that is so familiar to us, the hands and feet of Jesus, is so important for us. How can we love this world like Jesus does?
Yeah, you look at where Jesus's hands and feet went. They weren't with, the people that were sitting in the temples, right? Teaching and preaching. They were with people like us who were sinful and messed up. And people didn't like that he was going to the tax collector's house. That's not okay.
And the lepers.
And,
the social outcasts, the marginalized. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And women. And
my goodness,
all of these groups. And in our Christian social action class, we talk about the quartet of the vulnerable that are mentioned over and over and over again in the Old Testament. The poor, the orphaned, the widowed, and the strangers in this land, or the foreigners.
Exactly.
People who are at a disadvantage. And I love that this chapter had so many great ideas for how to do small things, but then also how to maybe even work your family toward doing some of those bigger moments, so that you not only create opportunities for service, but that like Keith was saying, like you were saying, that it's so important that it gets ingrained in your family as part of your family's identity and part of just reflecting the heart of God, that there's no enemies. And I think that's another way that sticky justice, biblical justice, flies in the face of the false sense of justice that may be floating out in our world, is that there isn't anybody that God isn't rooting for. There isn't anybody that God isn't fighting for, that he hasn't died for. And so sometimes I think we get into, I hate to say cancel culture, but, things like that, where we shut down the enemy and we say, we're on the right and you are in the wrong. But Jesus flies in the face of that. And I love that this book also just, again, is showing us that there's a different kind of justice. It's not the way the world works. It's the way God's heart works. And that's a good thing.
And I think that's such an important conversation for us, because I feel like particularly over the last 2 years, and it's just been stressful, right? And I do give so much credit to election seasons, right? A lot of times. But we get in this habit, and this is where, again, call the devil out. He's a jerk. There's other words I would like to use for him. But he's so good at what he does.
Yeah.
And And Jesus, right? One of the biggest places we can go to for Jesus, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Right? They're trying to accuse Jesus of being a part of the devil, and yet he's casting out demons. Right? And Jesus says that line, which is not Abe Lincoln, which I had a student do one time. I said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." They go, "Abe Lincoln." I was like, "Jesus Christ." And he goes, "Pastor." And I was like, "No, I was Jesus Christ who said that first." And but it's so true for us. I love what you said. God loves everybody, like even the one who is against him right now.
Even the Pharisees who were causing the pain. He said, "I long to gather you under my wings as a mother hen gathers her chicks." Like
Exactly.
he's crying out in anger because he wants to save and they're not letting him.
And he's a jealous God.
Yes.
Only, not jealous over people, jealous over the things that are trying to steal their hearts.
Yes. And he wants to steal everybody's heart back. And man, again, we talked a little bit earlier about a social justice issue or a justice issue of sex trafficking and how it's so easy to quickly point to evil men. Oh, but what a mission field.
Yeah.
And what does the heart of God want to do but to restore and renew and give mercy and new beginnings? And how can God equip men to be different and to empower them to live? Anyway, I could go on for...
Well, and that's where I think like the most challenging one of the most challenging statements Jesus says, because he gives a lot of them, right? But the idea of loving your enemies.
Yeah.
Right? He has to tell us that, right? It's not a natural thing. I remember one of my favorite sermons I ever got to do is on Leviticus 19, where you get that command of God to love your neighbor.
Yeah.
And just a spoiler alert, just in case I ever do this sermon again, this is kind of how it went, was I talk about how stiff-necked and hard-hearted God's people must have been to have to be told to love their neighbor. Right. And I just rail into them because all of us can be like, yeah, like that's so, and then, right. And then
your mirror.
I rail into God's people. And then eventually the mirror comes up and goes, oh, that's us.
Yeah.
How stiff-necked and hard-hearted must we be that we have to be told to love people. Right. But that's the language. Right. And I think this is a good segue into the beginning of the chapter. Right. Again, it's not the beginning of the conversation, because I feel like we're coming close to the end here, but I loved where it started. And this is very practical for you guys listening as parents, as people raising up kids, is what is your family about? Right. If you ask your kids right now, what is your family about? And I loved the examples it gave, especially from Kara's family of, our family is about loving God and loving our neighbor.
Oh my goodness, they had those 4 statements. I was like, oh my goodness. Talk
We
about being
gotta
beautiful.
find those now. What are those 4 statements?
Talk about being convicted a little bit. I was like, oh.
Was it page 124? I got a note there.
Yes.
Check that out.
Yeah, there it is.
Leaders and learners, people of gentle strength, content risk takers, and folks who love and serve God and others.
And ultimately, it goes in right after that to say that last one is so
is
critical
the
for
Uber
their
prayer,
family.
they call it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like this is what we want to be. Folks who love and serve God and others.
Yeah. I mean, and if every single one of us as Christians committed to that's what our family is about, how different would our world look?
Yeah.
Right. And then going into the statements, being able to say statements like, in our family, we, or in our family, we do not. Right. And she gave the example of one of the things for them, right, which is a great practice, a good practical thing, when people are asking for money. And so in our family, we don't give out money, we buy groceries. Right. That was a statement that they knew. And she tells the story of her, it was high school or 20s, 17-year-old daughter eventually was going into some store. Somebody asked her for money and she said the statement. And she could see from the car that her daughter was saying the statement, went and spent $17, something like that.
Of her own money, which is huge as the mother of a 17-year-old.
Yeah.
And then came out and then explained to mom what happened and did not ask for money to replace it, right? Because that's who we are.
Who she is.
Yeah, that's who we are as a family. We buy groceries. And being able to say that to someone that's asking for money, all of a sudden you're making an identity statement that is rooted in loving God and loving your neighbor. And I loved that. I thought that was so crucial, right, in the conversation. And that's the thing is, what is your family saying? In our family, we serve. In our family, we,
Right.
all these different questions. And it goes back to, Keith, what we started talking about was, who are you, not what do you do, right? In our family, this is our identity.
Right. I mean, it's kind of like even going to church. Are you a church-going family? If you are, you don't have to ask the question, hey, are we going to church tomorrow? It's Sunday, right? We're not sick. We're in town. We're on to church. I mean, there's just certain things that you do. Do we pray for meals? Do we have to ask? Are we going to pray? No, we just do that. Well, it's the same with being nice, same with being kind. Yeah, I like to tell a little story here that I learned something about justice one time. I was in Tanzania, and I was with missionaries there, and this lady missionary, she went around doing medical care. So she took me to this house, and it was, by American standards, not very, but it was the nicest house in the village. And she brought this man who obviously was very ill. He had very weepy eyes, I remember. And she was telling me how he was suffering from AIDS, and he had been very promiscuous with his life, and he had gotten AIDS and given it to his wife, and then his wife got sick, and he kicked her out, and his wife came to them very, very thin, less than 100 pounds, and they nursed her back to health with medicine and stuff, and she had become plumpy. That's the word that they like to use, because they like a little chunk on those women, and they actually ate this bar called Plumpy Nut. I always remember that. So they brought this guy out, and then this lady was helping her, and I said, well, who is this? She goes, well, this is his wife. She took him back to nurse him to health. Well, I mean, I got very angry. I mean, I was like, man, what kind of guy is this? And she said, she said, Keith, do you know what this man needs? And I was thinking, something like a baseball bat upside the head.
Right.
And, I mean, she convicted me very heavily that day. She said, he needs to know the love of Jesus. And that's why God's given him more time.
And that's why he gave him that woman.
And gave him back the woman. I mean, and I just thought, man,
Wow.
we talk about big moments, and it wasn't. It was just seeing someone in a remote part of Tanzania doing that, actually doing it. And I thought, wow.
Talk about justice, biblical justice.
Right. And, there's so many opportunities here in America, but we get political. We get, oh, not them, not, and me, I had some hate for that guy, hearing what he had done and how he had laughed at his wife when he kicked her out. But wow, God is good. I mean, God has his way of doing stuff. And ever since then, it's changed my heart, because there's no time for anger.
Amen.
There's no time for all that stuff, because, I look at people like today in road rage, and I try to tell people, let the guy cut you off. If he can be a jerk, but let him cut you off, and he's out of your life in 10 seconds.
Exactly.
Act upon it, and it could, end your life. So just a lot of stuff you just got to let go. God is with us in everything we do, in every action, and we're good.
I think too about like the parable of the wicked servant, and how he receives this mercy and then chokes his neighbor over $20, and I think, how many times did I kick God out of my life and laugh at him? How many times did I just treat God with such disdain, and he welcomes me back and he heals me,
Right.
And so just that diffuses my anger really quickly when I remember how many times I have pushed God aside, or I have treated Jesus with disdain. And that is a very humbling place. And that's again, the posture of seeking justice, not angry, fist pounding justice, but kind of that righteous anger against sin, against Satan, right? Targeted anger, not against people, but against everything that tears people away from God.
And I think I'd summarize all of this by saying, when you think about your families, when you think about your kids, when you think about your life and how you approach things like justice, are you looking at Jesus so that you can look at the world like Jesus does? Because that changes everything, right? Because when Jesus is in the room, right? And again, imagine Jesus said, hey, I'm coming to spend some time with your family. How's your life different? What do you do differently when Jesus comes to town? Because he's with you now. He is in town, and he's with you. How does that change? Yeah. And then what are the reminders that he has to say to you about how he sees things and how he understands things? And again, I think there's a level, Keith, when you were talking about it, I was kind of like, this is where good old fashioned Texas, bless your heart, comes in handy so well, right?
Right.
When someone else is having a hard day, when someone else is getting angry. This is a go-to for me, and it's like, because it's one of those things and there's a level of which there's that like tongue-in-cheek side of it, but then this honest, bless your heart. Wow.
You're really hurting.
You're really hurting right now. But there's that perspective, that Jesus perspective, that helps you to go, I don't have to hurt because you're hurting. I can be with you and I can do what I can do. And that's the
Right.
extent of it, and I'm not going to say something like, oh, that's tough, or that's hard. I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to talk with you and see what I can do and what need I have, but I'm going to be grounded in reality, which is God is still in control and Jesus is still ultimately the person I'm following and I'm listening to him, right? Not what everybody else thinks of me, what everybody else is torn up about and things like that. And I think this goes far beyond justice. It goes into just how we are living our lives too. So as we think about this, I know our listeners are always looking for the practical. Anything else that's kind of practical standing out to you about this chapter? I know one of the biggest things we started there because we were starting towards the end of the chapter was y'all ask your kids, what do they care about? Where do they see justice that they want to help out? Where do they see the widow, the orphan, the poor, the marginalized? And again, even the marginalized, isn't that such a political word now?
Yeah.
And it's like, y'all read scripture, reading scripture. Like they talk about the foreigner. Like, golly, here we are in Texas, and what a tough conversation for the church to have. Because yes, you do want safety for your neighbor when it comes to, and this is a very political word, borders, right? But you also are called to love and care for all people, right?
Yeah.
So how do you balance that? And I'm not talking about how you vote. I'm talking about when you have someone in front of you who needs help, what do you do? Because we have a food pantry here. Right. And it's what a great blessing it is to be able to feed people so often. But a lot of times these are people from other countries. Now I don't believe we're checking anything. We're just feeding, right? Because that's what we're asked to do. Here's someone who's hungry, give him food, right? This is Jesus saying, if you see someone naked, give him your cloak, right? Help them out. Whoever's there in front of you, just help them out. And then to some extent, this is where I'll somewhat land. And again, I feel like I'm being so political, but Jesus says, like, render to Caesar what's Caesar's and to God what's God's. Right? Live your life, right? By all means, ask for forgiveness, obey the law, right? Obey what you have in place for you, but love your neighbor. Don't let something else get in the way of loving and caring for your neighbor. I'm reminded of a story that Jennifer Keel brings up often. And Jennifer Keel is our Go director. She's been instrumental in getting our benevolence ministry off the ground. And I believe it was Mother Teresa was at a conference. I believe that's the story. Jennifer has a Catholic background, but it's one that's always stuck with her since she was a child, of Mother Teresa going to a conference about poverty and feeding, and about in 10 years, the issue of poverty in this area will be done, and the room is filled. Ooh. Threw the cup down off the table. In 10 years, the issue of poverty and hunger will be gone. But meanwhile, where was Mother Teresa? She wasn't in the conference. There was a man outside of the conference who was dying of hunger. And you have these hundreds of people inside the building talking about how they're going to solve the issue of hunger while someone outside is dying. So Mother Teresa takes him home and nurtures him and things like that. But he dies. He ends up dying of hunger. He was past that point. And so it's one of those things of, again, going back to our social medias, how much are we going to talk about it and how much are we going to actually be about it? And how are we not going to ask all the questions that stop us from serving, but just do, right? And go in and finally bring a little Luther into the conversation of social justice, the idea of sinning boldly. When Luther says that, it's not that he's holding up a pint and saying sin boldly, which is, I think, what a lot of Lutherans take it as. But it's one of these, at the end of the day, go and love and serve God and love your neighbor. And along the way, you might sin. Along the way, you might break some rules. You don't try to, you don't want to, but you're not perfect, right? So you're going to break the rules. Sin boldly out of love for God and love for your neighbor, And that's kind of where I camp at least. But yeah, ask your kids, serve as a family, find those opportunities is something we've been convicted of. And then I think the other crucial page, if you want to go to 146, I think was a really important page for us. Because I think some parents might be sitting here asking this question: what if my kid doesn't care? What if my kid doesn't want anything to do with any of this stuff? What do I do? What's kind of the takeaway when you see those words on 146?
Yeah, it says the most important thing to remember is that even more important than how deeply or even how actively our kids care now is that their faith eventually moves toward justice as a core and expressed value. And I think that, it's good to remember what they said, that adolescents tend to be self-absorbed. I mean, who isn't really? But the ability to see past your nose is something that we all have seasons that are better than others. And I think I think for me, I'm just reminded that like when the prophets are pleading with people, do they always get a response? No. But in God's timing, yes, people's hearts are moved. And so it's not up to you to convince your child, and you're probably not going to do it through a lecture, but God is working. And if you are faithful, know that he is too.
Well, and it went back to right at the very beginning of reading this book. One of the things they said was that kids' foundation for their faith are coming from their parents, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, your kid may not seem like they're watching or that they care, but they are. They're watching and listening and seeing everything we do.
Yeah.
Maybe not always responding to it, or at least not positively, but they're watching.
Right.
And if
And
that's
listening.
a part of our DNA, then,
Yeah.
Yeah, watching and listening. How do you talk about the least of these? How do
Absolutely.
you talk about people in tough situations? Where does your heart go out? Where do your kids get to see that in the words that you use and the things that you get to do too? And how do you also, this was a key part of the chapter that I kind of just don't want to gloss over it, but allow this to be a process. Going back, Keith, to what we were talking about, who you are. So before you go and serve at the food pantry, or before you go on a mission trip or something like, how are you framing it and talking about it beforehand? How are you experiencing it together? And then how are you debriefing afterwards too? What did you see? What did you learn? How did you feel about that? What do you think about poor people, before you go into it and things like that? I think all that
Or
is
what have you
crucial.
heard?
Yeah, what have you
Yeah, what
heard?
have you
Good
heard?
question. Yeah, I find questions so important when it comes to all this too. What do you think about so-and-so? Why do you feel that way? Where did you first hear that? And just being curious, again, not lecturing, another theme of the sticky faith perspective, but just listening and learning as well. And then again, modeling. And I think that's also crucial.
Well, I think it's also hard for some people to empathize with needy when they've never been needy. I mean, sometimes you have to live it. And, if you live through certain events, you are more empathetic toward them. And of course, don't go starve your kids so you understand what it means to be starving. I mean, that would be ridiculous. But, it's kind of like that. It's kind of hard to put yourself in their place. Like, why don't they get a job? Why don't they do this? Well, there's so many people like the homeless, and mental health issues that are out there, and they're not getting that help. And not everyone is fortunate. Maybe not everybody had the parents that you have, or the opportunity, or medicine, or whatever has happened in their life. But it's hard sometimes to get that message through, and that does come with maturity. That does come through life experiences that you can empathize with people more. But when you're a young person, we try to shield them from the harsh realities of life, and sometimes that just makes learning a little bit more complicated.
And that's why I'm so thankful for opportunities in my own life. I mean, similar to the Tanzania experience for you, Keith, of along the way, slowly getting opportunities to learn about people, to talk with people. I love our junior high mission trip. I always touted as kind of the best thing we get to do in student ministry, because one of the things we get to do is sit on the porch of Trinity downtown and talk with people who are homeless, hear their stories. I've met 21-year-olds. I've met 70-year-olds. I've met everything in between, and getting to hear their story, know their story. I mean, again, the 18-year-old or the young one, the 20-year-old, was really convicting, because it was just that he'd gone to college, but he never really made it home after the first year of college and just decided to be living on the streets. What a crazy thing that you don't even think about. He had a college education, was getting one, and then just didn't make it home for whatever reason. The 7-year-old, there's a guy, he went by Moses, because he was always talking scripture. I had some of the best theological conversations that I've had since seminary with him, because of how well he knew his scriptures. He was a retired military, worked in DC, was a big deal at the Pentagon, and now he was on the streets of Houston, So it's crazy that we assume all these things about someone, but we really have no idea. And I think that's why you get that command of God just to love, just to talk, just to care about, not to dismiss, not to walk by. I love toward the end of the church year, there's the passage from Amos comes up. I mean, this is the problem of the prophets, of God is saying you're completely ignoring the people that I
People around
love.
you, yeah.
And you kind of got your head in the ground like an ostrich, because you're not seeing the poverty. You're not seeing the issues. I mean, this is literature these days. I mean, Hunger Games, that's what this is about.
Yeah.
You have the Capitol that has no idea what's going on in the districts. There's just so many examples of this that it's like, okay, Christians, it's time to actually love, take baby steps. I mean, I remember getting to preach on Amos in Green Bay, and I remember the realization that within 5 miles, I want to say it was 5 to 10,000 homeless or something like that, or I think it was 5,000 kids below the poverty line within 5 miles of the church. And it was one of those things of like, okay, do we really take that seriously? I mean, because that's the thing, most of our hearts will go out for kids,
Oh,
you know,
sure.
because we see how they're not to blame, but y'all recognize these kids grow up, you know?
Yep.
And so eventually they become the adults who have stories and reasons and things like that. So, and how can we do that? How can we love the least of these?
And there's some resources that I just want to share. One is the stickyfaith.org.
Yeah.
The book brings it up several times. So if you're looking at how do I talk with my kids before, during, and after a sermon event or some sort of mission that we're going to go on, there's some resources there. But then there's also some great ideas. Maybe we can put some links to some organizations that do some of these experiential things for Christians just to help them learn about poverty, about sex trafficking, about some of these issues. Like maybe your family is interested, but you don't know where to go next. So maybe we can link.
Yeah, and the Facebook page and things like that. And speaking of that, right, with the email, raise EM up, raise EMUP at trinitycline.org. Ask your questions. We'd love to continue the conversation with you. Facebook page, I think that's a great place to be able to post some of these resources. Again, look them up, Raise Them Up Podcast. If you don't put in podcast, you'll be led somewhere else. But yeah, I think that's all great resources. Let's continue the conversation, you know, with parents. I think this was really good for us. And I think it's really good to have the conversation of justice. And I also love, I continue to journey with this book and see just the common themes. Talk with your kids, listen to your kids, don't lecture your kids, model for your kids, and look at Jesus ultimately, right? See what he has to say for your life. And see how he looks at your life, see how he sees your kids, recognize that he's in control, and we'll all be a little bit more reset in the end and balanced. Thank you guys so much for listening today. This has been a joy. Thank you guys for being here once again. And we look forward to talking with you next time as we talk about chapter 7 is a sticky bridge out of the home. So especially those that have college students or are looking at soon having college students, Jan.
I'm in denial.
That'll be a fun conversation. All right, we'll see you next time.